We have to wait a moment here for everyone to be added to the system by GoToWebinar. So we need to wait 10 seconds or so before we actually officially begin. So the broadcast will begin in a moment here. Yeah, still coming up. I think that's about it. Welcome everyone to the WellMed Institute's web talk for December 3rd, 2017. Today we will be hearing Elena Mustakova Posart talking about the topic of a psychology that responds to our time's transforming inner oppression into awakened, aligned, and liberated spirit. This is also being broadcast on Facebook and on our YouTube channel. So be sure to tell your friends, if they can't get in, to go take a look at the broadcast there. To give you a quick background about the WellMed Institute, which I do at the beginning of every web talk, we were established in January of 1995, so we're now coming up on our 23rd anniversary. We ran a face-to-face program called the Spiritual Foundations for a Global Civilization program for 10 years, 1996 to 2005. But we gradually phased that out as the core activities and study circles developed. We also began online courses starting in 1998, and that's the main thing that we do today. As of today, we've had 444 online courses and 11,774 registrants in those courses. So as you can see, our average course is around 25 or so, 20 to 25. Our registrants have lived in almost every country in the world, 123 anyway, which is pretty good. And they have used the classes to give countless presentations to various classes at study circles, feasts, firesides, you name it. They've been able to use the material in many, many different ways. In addition to our courses, we're now running these web talks, and they're now twice a month. We're also doing occasional webinars. We're looking at doing deepen web videos, especially for young adults, and we're continuously expanding our web publications. We've also started doing courses through the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, which are available for credit, but one must register at United in order to get credit and pay them their tuition, and they reimburse us. We're hoping, however, to spread that arrangement with many other schools and universities in the future. To introduce our speaker for today, Elena Mustakova Posart. She is an educator, social scientist, and former professor in adult developmental psychology. This is a fascinating subject. If none of you know anything about adult developmental psychology, I highly recommend you looking into books by Erik Erikson and well, Piaget does children's development, but it relates as well. Kohlberg and James Fowler and all kinds of people. It's a fascinating subject. In addition, she's a counselor and psychotherapist in private practice in the greater Washington, D.C. area. For the last 30 years, she's been focusing on lifespan development of critical moral consciousness and the role of cultural context in shaping human consciousness. Her dissertation won the 1995 Henry A. Murray Dissertation Award through Radcliffe College at Harvard University, and also the 1998 Outstanding Dissertation Award of the Association for Moral Education. She lectures extensively in the US and internationally. She's on her way home to Eastern Europe shortly. And she's been working on a second comprehensive volume that came out in 2014, of which she was a senior editor and chief contributor, Towards a Socially Responsible Psychology for a Global Era. It's been called an important book with a crucial message, because it sets out to achieve an extraordinarily important mission using Western psychology to create a more sustainable future. So Elena will be dealing with exactly these topics today in her presentation, and we can now turn the screen over to her. Boyd will switch it in a moment. And Elena, welcome to the WellMed Institute, and thank you so much for giving this web talk today. There it is.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this kind introduction. And thank you for this wonderful opportunity to take the time to reflect with all who are currently on this webinar on a psychology that responds to our times. It really is a wonderful opportunity to reflect on the unique challenges and possibilities of this time, to begin to transform the inner oppression that the majority of us feel to some extent or another, whether we realize it or not, into an awakened, aligned, and liberated spirit and consciousness. So I'm having difficulty switching my slides for some reason. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. So this is an age of infinite opportunity because we have acquired tremendous knowledge in the sciences and arts and humanities. And one of those areas, of course, is the field that I'd like to speak about, psychology, which has acquired so much knowledge about the human mind and behavior, which it studies, over the past century of its development as a science. This knowledge has allowed us to understand and treat a wide range of human emotional and psychological afflictions that were not understood in the past. There is also a growing wealth of self-help books and motivational speakers to assist people in understanding and transforming their lives. And yet, the majority of us know that there is a disconnect. Somehow, all of this understanding does not quite help the human mind to feel empowered in facing the complexity and deep contradictions of our rapidly changing global world. And so we live in what has been called an age of anxiety and of rapidly mounting emotional and psychological disturbances. Because of this, the World Health Organization announced a decade of global mental health, which is we're currently in until the year 2020. And the task of this decade is to really scale up our understanding and ability to respond to the needs of the times. Apparently, the approaches that we currently employ do not even remotely respond to what the world and humanity currently needs. So what is missing? As you can see here, the majority of humanity, a growing majority of humanity, already has access to universal education and, of course, the technological revolution that allows smartphones in every corner of our planet. There is also the emergent knowledge in the social, physical, and environmental sciences and humanities that is changing the way we think about understanding reality. Throughout the 20th century, the understanding of science was based on hierarchical thinking. And what's characteristic of hierarchies is that they have an absolute top and an absolute bottom. And the top of scientific knowledge, of course, were considered the physical sciences. What is happening now as we're thinking about the science of reality, a comprehensive science of reality, increasingly advanced thinkers are trying to understand that as a holarchy. A holarchy is different, as I said, than a hierarchy. It consists of holons, and that's a term that was coined by Arthur Koestler in 1967. And a holon is a part of the whole that also contains the blueprint of the whole. And so each holon in a holarchy is a level of organization that is every bit as important as every other level of organization. So when we think about science this way, comprehensive science that consists of the holons of each of the social, physical, environmental sciences and humanities, we see them as unique contributions, complementary to each other, and essential to our overall understanding of human reality. So as you think about the emergence of comprehensive science this way, you'll understand that this is indeed a time of remarkable opportunity. Of course, that's not how science is still taught. Comprehensive science is still taught in academia, But this is the purpose of this talk, for us to really look at what is growing and developing and is not getting announced on the headline news yet. These are trends that we need to learn to discern, and it is very empowering to understand them and very empowering to join in them consciously. So in this holarchic sense of science, we now think of levels of physical sciences, life sciences, which include the biological and health sciences, human sciences such as psychology, sociology, and also an emergent understanding of spiritual sciences. This is an age in which also a majority of people are moving towards what has been called integral spirituality, an emergent spirituality in this age that seeks to integrate the certainty and assurance of traditional religions and their stalwart faith and conviction in the goodness of the universe with the courageous commitment of the 20th century to question half-truths, along with the indigenous affirmation of the undeniable and pervasive reality of spirit all around us. In addition to this emergent integral spirituality, another aspect of what makes this an age of extraordinary opportunity, which is an aspect far less known to the majority of people, is the emergence in the middle of the 19th century of the systemic Baha'i revelation that really renewed religious and social thought and merits serious study for the benefit of all of us, since it is still not well known as a resource. So this convergence to create this convergence of all these aspects that have been discussed is creating unprecedented opportunity for all of us to no longer be simply swept by historic change, but to adopt an intentional approach to building human society. Another way to think about this age is, as Rob Stockman also recommended, as an age of adult development. It is a very exciting field, which really began to develop in the second half of the 20th century. And it took shape around the work of Carl Jung, Erik Erikson, Robert Kegan, Lawrence Kohlberg, Mary Belenky, Daniel Levinson, and a host of others. What's characteristic of this field is the emergence of a systematic understanding of how adult structures of knowing and being can actually evolve in the lifespan. It is really the first time in history that we are understanding that it is within the reach of every adult to become intentional in their personal development through the lifespan, and therefore also in the quality of the personal and community life that we create. This systemic structural approach that we are discussing now, and that certainly has been emerging throughout the 20th century, in fact began in the first half of the 19th century in the teachings on individual and societal transformation by a Persian nobleman who later became known by the name of Baha'u'llah. His writings spoke to the essence of the religious teachings of the past and articulated universal principles and a comprehensive philosophy of modern life, pointing to the essentials for establishing a divine economy on this planet and for building institutions that can indeed safeguard peace and achieve the organic and spiritual unity of the body of nations. As you hear me say that, you probably realize what a vast and daunting goal this is that really was released into human consciousness in the early part of the 19th century, something that we're still very much struggling with. But it's important to understand that his teachings released a fresh energy into the world that was standing at that time at the threshold of a global era. And these teachings have propelled since then dramatic developmental forces and processes that we're experiencing today, and that are important to also understand. So the systemic approach began to develop within a few decades after the revelation of Baha'u'llah, when the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who has become known as the father of sociology, really became the architect of modern social science. And it's interesting to notice that his writings began at the turn of the century. His first publication was 1892, which it's important to note was also the year of the passing of Baha'u'llah. And as we continue this conversation and realize the understanding of reality as unitary and interdependent, surely these so-called coincidences no longer look as much to be coincidences. But the question that Durkheim's work centered on is he tried to study the emergent new social institutions by trying to understand how societies can maintain their integrity and coherence in modernity in the absence of traditional social and religious ties. And how prescient that question was at the time in the transition to the 20th century. We can look back 100 years later now and realize how profoundly this question still stands in front of us. Shortly after the emergence of his work, we became aware of the work of Austrian biologist and philosopher Ludwig von Bertalanffy, whose work became known as general systems theory. Bertalanffy published his first work, The Modern Theories of Development, in 1927. And what he was focusing on studying was the nature of open systems and how open systems develop. Of course, living systems are all open systems with emergent properties, as you can see on the screen. And in order to study these living systems, he brought together for the first time ontology, philosophy of science, physics, biology, computer science, engineering, economics, philosophy, psychology, political science. So this was a remarkable work. Shortly after that, Immanuel Wallerstein began to think in terms of world systems analysis, which is yet another major advance in systemic thinking. In his macro approach, the unit of analysis is world system. And then, of course, there is also the revolutionary work of Jean Piaget, who observed how children, through play, get to know and understand their reality, and came to realize that they're just not accumulating more knowledge and information, that what's really happening is that their internal structures of knowing and operating on reality are undergoing an evolutionary restructuring process. And that opened the door to what we now know as the field of adult development, because we used to think that it's only children's structures of knowing and acting on reality and interacting with reality that evolve. Now we know that that possibility is there throughout the adult lifespan, to the extent to which we become intentional. So the systemic approaches throughout the 20th century were all characterized by interdisciplinarity and an obvious quest for integrative principles. But it would not be a full representation of the challenge in front of us if we did not acknowledge the shadow side of the systemic approaches throughout the 20th century. What we also saw is the emergence of totalizing approaches to societal reordering. An example, of course, is the way that Karl Marx's theory of labor was interpreted and misused by communism to create what was a very totalitarian and repressive regime in which I happened to grow up. But we also have experienced Nazism, genocides throughout the 20th century, which continue now, forced assimilations. And so there is a very painful legacy of the 20th century systemic and totalizing approaches that we're dealing with now. As a result of this legacy, there is now a deep distrust for any systemic approach to reordering society, and a genuine fear of supranational organizations such as the United Nations, for example. And that is happening vis-a-vis the apparent systemic nature of our planetary problems and the increasingly apparent need for systemic planetary solutions, both social and environmental. So clearly we are at a threshold and there is a real challenge in front of us. So, as I said earlier, in the beginnings of this structural approach, as revealed by Baha'i in the early 19th century, there were in fact contained principles that protected against such totalizing. But because this revelation is still very unknown to the majority of humanity and not well understood, not thoroughly studied yet, most of us don't realize that the structural principle that best protects against totalizing systems is what Baha'i described as the complementarity of scientific and religious knowledge in solving the problems of humanity. He clarified that both scientific and religious knowledge are relative and therefore emergent because they're the products of human minds, and human minds, as we already saw, evolve. That is not to claim that there is no absolute truth, but to say that any efforts on our part to describe it are evolutionary. From that follows that the viability of any solutions to the problems of a global age depend on the actual degree of complementarity between these equally legitimate sources of human knowledge and understanding. And here you see a quote from a Baha'i source called Promulgation of Universal Peace, where Baha'i explained the harmony of science and religion and declared that religion should be in complete harmony with science and reason. And he clarifies, if religious belief and doctrine is at variance with reason, it proceeds from the limited mind of man and not from God. Therefore, it is unworthy of belief and not deserving of attention. The heart cannot find rest in it, and real faith is impossible. How can a man believe that which he knows to be opposed to reason? Is this possible? Can the heart accept that which reason denies? Reason is the first faculty of man, and the religion of God is in harmony with it. This is a profound principle to reflect on, and of course this slides and these quotes will be up after this talk, so you will have the opportunity to investigate them further and to do some more reflection. But it's important to understand that as we now still feel so fragmented in our secular education and our experience of faith, if we have such an experience, we actually have the opportunity to apply reason to both and to begin this path of integration that this talk is about. So what does that mean for a disillusioned humanity in our current context of interreligious genocidal wars, religious extremism, clashing religious and secular ideologies, and rampant materialism, amidst which ordinary people find it less and less possible to put faith and heart in anything? This is the internal oppression that I'm referring to. As a psychologist, what I witness every day is that our relationship to meaning is broken. The rational soul, the rational human soul, is by nature an active participant in the social order. We are social beings, and meaning making is our most fundamental activity. And so in our current context of increasingly meaningless, tangential, and expedient social relationships amidst global corruption, we cannot thrive. Regardless of how many yoga classes we attend, how much we meditate, how much health food we buy and eat, we cannot help ourselves and our children thrive. So an effective psychology of this age has to speak to our systemic inner oppression, because systemically our relationship to meaning is broken. We are oppressed by our unconscious beliefs, fears, and expectations, by the appearances that we try to project. We also live in contexts that disempower us, because we continuously get the message that we're purely biological beings stuck in our impulses and with no greater purpose to life than competing in social contexts to consume and meet our needs. We are also deeply disempowered by a flattened consumer language produced by a consumer culture that has lost depth, imagination, and has become crudely materialistic. This flattened language distorts the soul's aspiration for truth and meaning into ideological isms that are constantly clashing in the public realm. We feel that something is missing. And so we are easily drawn to ideological pseudo-truths that march as inspired answers. And we're constantly claimed by competing and corrupt ideologies. So, in response to this, a growing majority of people in social science and psychology are working towards the emergence of what is still a poorly acknowledged but vast and comprehensive process underway. And as you see on the slide, this process is underway in the social, physical sciences, and humanities of finding a convergence of scientific and spiritual understanding about human mind and society. Such a convergence that can inform the applied spheres and translate into rational collective governance and decision-making, and foster pervasive evolution of collective consciousness. This approach to thinking about restructuring the life of mind and society by nature has to be a dialectical approach, since all human knowledge and social experience is interconnected and an evolving living system. All processes and solutions that emerge need to be subject to scrutiny and infusion from both core scientific and core religious understanding, where each serves as a corrective to the other, and both evolve in the context of the dialectical tension between them. So we're moving from totalizing either or solutions, where something is either right or wrong, either true or untrue, and learning to hold these dialectical tensions, in the process of which we evolve more complex and comprehensive answers. So undoubtedly, there is a developmental shift underway, and it's important and very powerful for us to understand it, because the more we understand it, the more we're able to consciously participate in it. It's a developmental shift that the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire described as becoming the subjects of history, which means that for the majority of human evolution, ordinary human beings have been the recipients, the objects of waves of ongoing historical changes, cataclysmic changes oftentimes. But at this point in our evolution, we have the opportunity to understand and choose our own evolutionary process. And that we understand to be the acme of adult development from the point of view of a holarchic understanding of comprehensive science. So the need for a systemic approach and response to our age has been recognized as the increasingly daunting web of our challenges is in front of us. And that was the inspiration that was behind the volume on socially responsible psychology for a global era, which Rob Stockman mentioned at the beginning, which was published in 2014, and on which this talk is based. This kind of systemic response, however, no longer implies just scientists or institutions, it implies each of us. and each field of collective endeavor. In the absence of a systemic approach, we are fundamentally morally incoherent and therefore unhealthy, both individually and as societies. In fact, as we painfully experience every day, moral incoherence has become the norm around us, from leaders and institutions of governance to Nobel Peace Prize recipients, and certainly to ordinary consumers. Health, on the other hand, both individual and collective, can be described as the experience of coherence between our body, mind, heart, and spirit in our concrete socio-historical contexts and communities. Health is the coherence of meaning that synchronizes and optimizes functioning on every level. So, if the meanings we ascribe to different parts of our lives do not cohere as part of a larger meaning, or yet even contradict or conflict the health and well-being of others, then we of course experience stress, anxiety, and depression, which are all symptoms of our incoherence. There are also well-documented signs of global incoherence. In the year 2000, a member of the World Health Organization proposed that, and this was generally accepted, that we're currently living in the context of a worldwide social breakdown syndrome. And let's just pause for a moment and look at the description of this social breakdown syndrome. It's characterized by a deepening disintegration of the socio-moral fabric of life on the planet, a rising incidence and prevalence of psychosomatic diseases, mental disorders, anxiety and neurosis, prostitution, crimes, political corruption, and a variety of sexual diseases, including AIDS. And even worse, the alienation of large segments of society, the depersonalization of individuals, and large and growing numbers of groups of people living precariously on the periphery of society. That is the systemic outcome of our individual and collective moral incoherence at this time, of our actual challenge. We also see emergent early efforts at a systemic approach, and a wonderful example of that, of course, is the epidemiological research of the World Health Organization and scientists all over the globe who have been able to identify that human health, both physical and mental, depends on social determinants. And you can see them on the screen, and of course we'll all recognize them. They include economic stability, education, access to proper education, healthy social and community contexts, and that of course is a big question mark right there, access to quality of health and healthcare, and of course the quality of our neighborhood and built environments. So the United States, for example, has adopted a report called Healthy People 2020, which identifies these as focus areas for national and global policies. Another remarkable example at emergent systemic efforts to address our systemic reality is a publication that came out in 2009. The title is The Spirit Level, and in it, epidemiologists from the United Kingdom, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, you can see their affiliations at the bottom of the screen, researched 23 developed countries, and what their extensive statistical research showed is that the greatest predictor for psychological well-being, beyond attaining a basic material standard of living, is the greater social equality of a society in terms of wealth distribution and stratification, which is an extraordinary finding. In other words, almost every measure of well-being, from life expectancy to mental health, violence, or illiteracy, is affected less by how wealthy a society is and much more by how unequal it is. So right there, we have the beginnings of a very clear understanding of what social restructuring of life on this planet really implies and requires of all of us. And yes, we are in the midst of this global tension between this emergent systemic understanding and our attitudes and dominant attitudes, in which obsolete and partial sectoral viewpoints and interests of particular groups still continue to dominate governance and decision-making, creating a deep tension between our actual choices and the possibility for a sustainable future for our children. In this context, when our team gathered to do the work on the volume on socially responsible psychology, we realized that a good place to start is to identify the normative frames of reference that humanity has found consensus on in the 20th century. And we felt that the most representative of those were the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Earth Charter. These are statements of global consensus of moral values and principles for a sustainable world. So what we did is we examined them in terms of psychological principles and processes that they embody. And we then began to study these principles and processes vis-a-vis current psychological assumptions in the field, so that we can really help move along towards a template and guiding principles of a systemic approach to socially responsible psychology, which implies the need for a major restructuring of research, teaching, and clinical training. What does it mean to become socially responsible? I offer one possible way to think about it here as acting from a compelling and defining awareness of the moral impact and reverberations of our every choice throughout an interconnected, globalizing world. Such an understanding of social responsibility implies psychological self-awareness, much greater than our ordinary awareness. It also indicates that if psychology is to respond to a global era, it would need to work not only with decision makers on every level, but also it would need to collaborate with communities of praxis, communities for social action and spiritual communities that are developing their own approaches to addressing issues of social justice. Again, we keep coming back to this idea of complementarity of scientific and spiritual knowledge and understanding, and a holarchic approach to science. The calls for a global community psychology began at the turn of the century. A well-known figure in that field of community psychology is Anthony Marcella, who raised a call for psychology to really transcend its ethnocentric and individualistic approach and begin to speak to the social and cultural contexts of the whole of humanity. We are also witnessing vast processes of global mind change. I can't spend a lot of time on this here, but these are some pointers that you can look at later. I'm borrowing the term global mind change from the 1998 book of Willis Harman, who was a physicist, engineer, futurist, and one of the first directors of the Institute of Noetic Science. And it helps you to appreciate the shifts underway that we don't realize in our daily lives, to see that cosmonaut Edgar Mitchell, when he came back from landing on the moon in 1971, described this profound experience, this spiritual experience of universal connectedness that he had as he was leaving the moon and approaching the Earth and watching it float in the vastness of space. As he said, I went to the moon as a technician and came back as a humanitarian. So in 1973, he founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences with the purpose to study individual and collective transformation through consciousness research, transformative learning, and engaging a global community. again, just to become aware of context and years, this is a little over 100 years after these ideas were first released into human consciousness in the early part of the 19th century. Another significant aspect of global mind change that many people don't know is actually underway is exemplified by the work of Roger Sperry on split brain patients. He received the '81 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine with his brain research, and when he was receiving his prize, he acknowledged that his mind-brain discoveries now gave him ample reason to recognize the primacy of consciousness as a causal reality. Friends, this is an extraordinary statement that took place in 1981, in the midst of materialistic science, which to this day teaches our children the primacy of matter. And yet, there is ample advanced scientific understanding that recognizes that consciousness is a causal reality, in fact. And that's very important when we talk about health and healing. So, generally speaking, a psychologically informed movement for global mind change is a movement from fragmentation to integration and towards an integrated vision of reality, as we've already spoken, which really began with the revelation of Baha'u'llah in the early 19th century. And this, it requires all of us to use the tools of both science and spiritual understanding in order to move towards greater coherence. So, the 20th century has really led to a deep opening of the modern mind to its internal horizons. With the birth of modern psychology, we have come to appreciate and understand the depths and complexity of the unconscious processes of mind, and also our power to regulate mind and to overcome limiting biases and inherited inertia of mindsets. This psychologically informed approach allows us to begin to heal our incoherence and to move towards greater coherence. And here I'd like to offer to you this visual image of our internal horizons, which I'd like to call the iceberg. And in this iceberg, as you can see, only the tip of the iceberg is in fact our conscious awareness, which also constitutes our conscious sense of identity, itself a very vast construct, but it helps to think of it in terms of three large groups of values, vocation, and very broadly speaking, sexuality, in terms of how we experience our embodiment as gendered beings, how we think about love, relating to one another. As you can see, below the line of awareness, however, is the vast majority of our psyche, and it is unconscious. And for the majority of us, there is a deep split between our conscious sense of identity and our unconscious psyche. How do we know that? Well, we know that because we hear and experience the rumblings that you see in red at the very foundation of our sense of identity, when we suddenly experience unaccountable bouts of anxiety and depression, when we cannot find happiness in our beautiful families and children, in our relationships, when we experience road rage, when we certainly know that something is wrong with us, but we don't know what. These tensions signal deep, unexamined beliefs and limiting mindsets. They also signal unresolved developmental tensions and conflicted conditioning from our childhood. And psychological processes really allow us to choose to begin to examine and integrate. And you notice that in this iceberg, for the first time, the line of awareness is not a firm line, but is a dotted, permeable line, because as we choose to examine, we begin to drop this line of awareness deeper and deeper, and we bring into awareness and our understanding our, up to that point, unexamined, unconscious beliefs and mindsets, the inertia that governs them, and our conditioning and developmental tensions that are still unresolved. And we also begin to look more thoughtfully into our personal, communal, and societal contexts that hold our lives. In some cases, we go as far as beginning to think more deeply about our intergenerational legacy, which is a powerful process of personality integration. At the same time, we now have the benefits of anthropology and comparative religion that have really opened also our external horizons, so that we have come to understand that the world's cultural and religious constructions of reality, which are widely varied, have in fact a common core. And one way to describe this common core is through a vertical and horizontal dimension that they all share. The common spiritual core of humanity identifies a vertical connection between our core sense of self and an unknowable creator, as well as a connection, a very central connection to the earth that sustains us and to the generations that have walked before us. It also recognizes across spiritual and religious teachings and cultures a very important horizontal dimension, expanding circles of relatedness, connectivity, and social belonging. And when we integrate that into our iceberg, we see that in integrating and becoming more healthy, what is involved is our awakening to our inner center, that vertical dimension that connects us to the unknowable essence of all life, and also to the earth and its living systems. And that is a process that is greatly facilitated by meditation and contemplative practices such as prayer, also mind-body practices, a wide range of them, and connection to nature. And also there's the horizontal dimension of expansion and examination. In people who are truly becoming healthy, we see these expanding circles of belonging that begin to include more and more collective humanity. And what's the powerful signal for true healing is that people realize that the best way to heal themselves is in fact to serve the healing of others, to serve humanity. So this harmonizing of scientific and religious understanding, as you can see, is certainly taking place in the area of psychology and psychotherapy and healing and mental health. And there are some further quotes here that you can explore later that help reflect on this. But the best way that I can summarize this movement from inner oppression to health through recognizing our deep resources is through this beautiful quote. O thou who hast cast thy splendor over the luminous realities of men, shedding upon them the resplendent lights of knowledge and guidance, and hast chosen them out of all created things for this supernal grace, and hast caused them to encompass all things, to understand their inmost essence, and to disclose their mysteries, bringing them forth out of darkness into the visible world. Friends, is this how we understand the purpose of our brief lives here? Lighting within ourselves the resplendent lights of knowledge and guidance, encompassing all things, understanding their inmost essence, disclosing their mysteries. Is this the language that we are exposed to every day that defines the purpose of life? And how then do we model for our children this awakened, aligned, and liberated spirit? So, as I've already said, the complementarity of psychological and spiritual understanding is evident in the study of consciousness. Suffice it to say, the perennial wisdom traditions have always recognized the creative, intuitive, spiritual intelligence at the center of our being. Remember that vertical dimension that is not limited to our personal minds and personal ways of knowing and being. And we are increasingly seeing that as we tap into that intuitive spiritual intelligence, our personalities restructure around that. In the area of perception as well, psychology and spiritual wisdom traditions very much agree. There is a general understanding that perception is greatly influenced by conscious and unconscious beliefs. And of course, our unconscious beliefs are shaped in us early on, but every spiritual tradition has always recognized that the prime task of adult life is to become awakened from our unconscious beliefs and to come to know our inner reality and see how we create our experience. And if perception and our beliefs are so crucial, then we have to recognize the role of worldview in our liberation. I studied years ago the ontogenesis in the lifespan of optimal, moral, empowered consciousness through interviews of adults from 2 cultures. And what was very interesting is that the people who manifested empowered moral consciousness described a wide variation of ethical and spiritual worldviews, but what was characteristic of all of them was that they had a central and defining love for the true, the good, and the beautiful, which allowed these people to continue to be propelled forward into searching for truth and meaning and purpose. And in their higher states of consciousness, they were able to describe this experience of being at one with the universe, with all life. In religious and spiritual traditions, that is referred to as gnosis. So, the 3 structures of mind that develop are cognition, emotion, and volition, and they develop through a dynamic interdependent process in which these 3 structures can move towards increasing overlap, as we will see in the next picture here. This itself is a very fascinating chart that merits a lot of study. I've borrowed it, as you can see, from Macintosh. But what I'd like to draw your attention to right now is that in the evolution of the 3 metaspheres of cognition, emotion, and volition, Macintosh recognizes the critical role of worldview. And this spiral implies that worldviews also follow an evolutionary sequence, as do people in their adult developmental pathways. And so worldviews matter. And as we are understanding that, we're coming to appreciate again the role of cultivating volition and will. And this was an area that was very neglected in 20th century psychology. And so the questions of moral action, rational choice, and character were not fully dealt with. But now we are coming to realize that through awareness, accountability, and daily psychospiritual practice, we cultivate our will to discover a greater love and a greater meaning and a worldview that sustains our personal and collective evolution. We also do experience still a collective paralysis of will for reasons which I've already spoken about, the legacy of totalizing frameworks of the past, and we also are still fighting inner oppression. And in that, the final point I'd like to look at here is the role of language. Language has always had a fundamental function in structuring human experience and the human psyche. And so language can be both a powerful tool for inner oppression and for the liberation of spirit. The flattened, materialistic, and meaningless language we're exposed to in daily life is a very powerful source for reproducing our inner oppression. And of course, our choice to expose ourselves to language that is essentially and fundamentally spiritual, that uplifts and ennobles us, is a choice to give ourselves a chance to move beyond inner oppression. And so Compare this enjoinder to our daily language. The fruits of the tree of existence are trustworthiness, loyalty, truthfulness, and purity. Notice the effect of these simple words on our sense of dignity and self. And compare that to the way people regularly complain every day of stress, disempowerment, and low self-esteem. So, attention is very important in volition. That's another area of psychological study. We are increasingly able to show that how and what we attend to affects what we perceive, which of course affects how we interpret and experience our experience. So once again, what we direct our attention to indicates the shaping power of language and worldview. As we're moving towards globally mature clinical practice, clinicians are challenged to overcome moral relativism, which was so characteristic of 20th century clinical work. I can't stop on these slides now, but they're there for you to examine the movement towards integrative approaches to health, and also what integrative psychotherapy for global health in fact tries to do and tries to focus on. These will be here afterwards, and I encourage you to look at them more deeply. What I'd like to point to now is that integrative approaches are emerging not just, of course, in psychology, which was my focus today, but across fields. In addition to the science of mind, of course, environmental science is increasingly integrative, and we have some illustrations of publications like that here. Agriculture and global economy, population health, all of these integrative approaches across fields are pointing to the unity of the human experience, to the essential unity of human knowledge about reality and reality itself, all of which were principles explained by Baha'u'llah in the beginning of the 19th century. So we are now able to say confidently what he taught 160 years ago, that scientific claims without the corrective of religion frequently amount to materialistic arrogance, and religious claims without the corrective of science amount to superstition, and neither can alone claim absolute truth. With that, we come to the close of this presentation, and you see here a way to think about the unity consciousness or spiritual consciousness that's emerging in each one of us and in our collective consciousness as well, even though once again that's not something you hear on primetime news or on the news at all. So this is something we have to discern around us and look for in order to recognize. And I would like to close with this beautiful quote from the Promulgation of Universal Peace, which describes unity processes in the advancement of human civilization. When the holy divine manifestations or prophets appear in the world, a cycle of radiance, an age of mercy dawns. Everything is renewed. Minds, hearts, and all human forces are reformed. Perfections are quickened. Sciences, discoveries, and investigations are stimulated afresh. And everything appertaining to the virtues of the human world is revitalized. So, as we close this presentation today, friends, may we begin to own the need to examine the moral foundations on which our individual and collective decisions are based, and to also own our powers of intellect and wisdom as a spiritual endowment, which is to be now carefully and responsibly cultivated. As a great teacher from the Middle East wrote a century ago, may godlike impulses radiate from the conscience of mankind, and may we resolve together to arise and lay hold of all that promotes the dignity, value, and station of the entire human race. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. That was fascinating. And I think people will very much enjoy and appreciate the comments that you made. I was struck, I'd long thought about human beings being involved in two, shall we say, fundamental relationships, the vertical one with God and the horizontal one with our fellow human beings and with society. But I think this makes it clear that there's really the third relationship, and that's the inner relationship as well, that's extremely important. And in fact, all three of them bring about the development of each other. You can't really separate them. And that's, again, I think another lesson of this particular presentation as well, that we can see that the moral character, which only really gets expressed through our interaction with others, is also something that liberates us and helps us to develop internally as well. So thank you again. This really was quite interesting that way. Let me see what we have in terms of questions, and we may have some already. Yeah, we do. Let me expand this. Joshua says, regarding the conscious self-values, sexuality, and vocation, where does race fit in? That has a prominent role in the experience of conscious identity in this current age.
That is a wonderful, wonderful question, and really maybe invites us to rethink how we describe our constructed sense of identity, because in the modern age, race has become a very central aspect of identity. That, of course, didn't used to be the case until the 20th century, because people used to live in very homogeneous groups, social groupings, and were really having very few encounters with people who looked or acted too different from them. But race is a central construct, and I appreciate this question, and I'd like to reserve the opportunity for all of us to reflect on that.
Huh.
It's a great open question.
Yeah, I think it really is a marvelous question, because it does make you think about identity and how all these different factors you talked about in your presentation today are all shaped and colored by issues of race. So yeah, I think that's a very good one.
Thank you.
And I think similarly that one can ask a similar question about gender, and you did touch on that slightly, seems to me, in your presentation.
Yes, sexuality is certainly universal to the human experience, and because on this plane we live in an embodied life, and our bodies are gendered, and so that's a pretty universal experience. Whereas I'd like to come back to the previous question. Race is a construct. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to see how this construct of race has in fact so permeated our sense of identity in a global and globalizing age. Because of course, research in the sciences shows that our genetic endowment we share across humanity, and our genetic differences across what we now describe as racial boundaries are much smaller than our genetic differences within what we describe as the particular racial boundary. So we know that race is a social construct, but it's one that really has colored sense of identity in this age, painfully so.
Yeah, very much so. I'm wondering, I'm looking to see.
And of course,
please.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add that from a spiritual perspective, we do understand, and that's very clear when we study the spiritual core of world religious traditions, that there's really only one human race, as Baha'u'llah very clearly announced in the century, and that is the human race. And it has an infinite range and shades of colors and differences and constructed socio-historical experience, which we need to learn to honor and integrate.
Yeah. While I'm waiting for another question, it occurs to me, since we've been talking a little bit about adult developmental psychology, I'm wondering if you see parallels between the stages of adult life in terms of moral development and the stages humanity has been going through in the last century or so. I don't know whether there is any parallel, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
Most certainly, it's a wonderful question. Thank you so much, Rob. A number of people in the field of consciousness studies are actually recognizing this evolutionary nature of worldviews. As I mentioned earlier, I think in the slide that I showed you on the evolution of cognition, affect, and volition, we saw the author of that slide was really showing the evolutionary nature of worldviews. And we do see a parallel of the emergent worldview of unity consciousness or integral spirituality, as you saw it described in some of my slides at the end of the presentation. This worldview certainly corresponds to the authentic stage of development of adulthood, where people are so clearly differentiated and integrated as individual persons that they are less focused on protecting the boundaries of their individual personhood and more oriented towards deep listening across boundaries and a growing understanding of our interconnectedness and the way that we all get enriched by this process of joining in this oneness, in this process of really realizing oneness. So this evolutionary worldview, which we now refer to as emergent integral spirituality, unity consciousness, it certainly is the worldview that Baha'u'llah released in the early part of the 19th century as an offer to an unsuspecting humanity, is very much an evolutionary worldview that corresponds to the further reaches of individual adult development. And what's beautiful about development, this is really important to understand, is that every next stage of development incorporates earlier stages, does not reject them. It incorporates them into systems that are more comprehensive and better integrated, so that whatever contradictions may have been contained in an earlier worldview become resolved at this higher level of complexity of systemic organization. But also that which is valuable in earlier worldviews is retained and becomes part of a larger system.
Right, which is very similar to Kohlberg's concepts of moral development and such, it seems to me. Sohaila has this comment. She says, thank you. You gave me a glimpse of a fascinating approach to healthy society, especially at this time. Cannot wait to revisit your talks when they are on the website. So we will certainly be able to get that up pretty quickly. And Ashley says this. He says, in regards to language, how do we change our vocabulary to a discourse that can be understood by all? That is, if people can't even define some of the terms that were covered, how can we provoke change without dumbing down the language?
That's an excellent question, and I'm very glad that our listener has actually focused on the power of language. What we really have to do first is to simply begin to become aware of the language we use every day. That is the first and most important step, because it's the language that shapes us, and also the language that we and our children are exposed to. There are things we can control and things we cannot control. But for example, creating family environments where families read together spiritual sources. Families pray and meditate together and study spiritual sources. The examples with the quotes that I gave you a distinct sense of the impact of a different kind of language on our sense of self-esteem and dignity as souls. So we have the choice to introduce that language into our daily family life, and equally importantly, into our daily personal practices. So as we begin our days, and are getting ready and gearing up to be exposed to a hectic, two-dimensional, highly materialistic reality, professional reality that we most of us work in, It is important to begin the day with meditation and some excerpts from spiritual writings that speak to our souls, that allow us to center in that vertical dimension that you saw on the chart, and that give a language to this centering that we relate to. So that language may differ, and probably will differ from person to person. The spiritual sources and poetic sources and literary sources that we connect to will vary, even if it's within one revealed tradition. But it's important to look for that ourselves and to be mindful and intentional in what we use, because the language that we use actually becomes the unconscious structurer of our thoughts. So becoming mindful of the language we use and choosing the language we use is a step. It doesn't have to be a universal language.
Yeah. We have an interesting question here from, I suppose it must have come in on Facebook. Someone emailed it to me. Robert says, do you have a short list of readings or books that can be helpful for us to explore?
That's a good question. Actually, you can see some excellent books on the slide on emergent integrative fields. I highly recommend those books. The book 11 is an extraordinary source, and there actually has been a web talk on that book, which I think is an excellent web talk, and I encourage you to really listen to it, watch it.
And of course, we have a Wilman Institute course on it too going on right now.
Wonderful, yes. In terms of adult development, of course, all the writers that I mentioned, I think it was the third slide, as well as James Fowler and a host of others, they all each have a seminal work that is very interesting to read. You may be interested in looking at our volume towards socially responsible psychology for a global era, because it has, each chapter is a collaborative chapter by a team, written by a team, and it has quite a range of sources there, from reports, spiritual reports, the role of spirituality in mental health, which you might find very helpful, to original sources. So I would suggest you begin right there.
Maybe if you could give us a little list of some of these in a Microsoft Word document, or even as an email, we could add them to add that document to our website about your web talk, so people could then find this list of recommended additional readings. If you could do that, we'd appreciate that.
Yes, certainly. That's a wonderful idea. Thank you. I'll be happy to do that. Yeah.
Great. Catherine asks this question: for those of us who are not in the field of psychology, how can we take this approach into our daily lives? I understand the need to examine our own inner oppression. How do we take that enlightenment and apply it in our communities and in other fields of work? And how do we find hope in this time of despair?
A profound question, isn't it?
It is.
Where do we begin? Well, first of all, that was the reason for this whole presentation, is to make it accessible to people who are not in psychology. As you study the iceberg in its final fourth version that you have on the slideshow, you can see the processes that are involved in this. And these are processes that are well within the reach of every one of us in this age of universal education and technological age and information. So we also, of course, learn and heal best in communities. And that's one of the important takeaways that I hope people have heard. Unlike what we thought in individualistic Western psychology in the 20th century, we are so much social beings. Our health and our unhealth happens in community context. So it's very important for us to find holding environments that sustain us. Spiritual communities, communities of praxis, neighborhoods. For example, in the Baha'i faith currently, people are working to try to open community contexts for people of all beliefs and convictions and faith backgrounds. These are community contexts that don't require anybody, they do not proselytize, they don't involve the change of faith, but they involve the study together of spiritual principles that speak to life, and creating communities of dialogue and learning and serving together. And that's a wonderful way to heal together. And let's not forget that a fundamental aspect of healing is actually also serving the healing of others. Here in Metro DC, we just started an adult coaching group, and people have been coming to this group for the same purpose. People, again, from all walks of life. Starting in January, we're going to have a group that will expand that to the general public, and it will be already called Heart-Mind Coherence, and it will meet regularly here and be accessible to people in the Metro DC area. For those of you who are interested, you can talk to me more. But again, finding communities, some of the references that will be available at the end of the slideshow. Talk to fellow human beings, ask these questions. You know, every time that I have had the privilege to help open these kind of contexts and discussions for others, people say the same thing to me. How come we don't have context for meaningful conversations like this anywhere else in our lives? What is wrong? And my response is, if we don't, then we have to create them. We have to begin to open up these meaningful conversations and contexts, invite people in your home, go through this slide presentation or those parts of it that make sense to people, and talk together. Talk about your experience, share, and then study some of the resources. And that's a way to start. Anybody can do it.
Yeah, and I think
so thanks.
listening
this is
to
a wonderful question.
I think listening to the talk a second time and looking over the slides also will help many of the insights sink in. This is always the case. Whenever we hear anything, we usually only hear a quarter or a third or maybe a half of it at once. So we often need to hear it several times. Ashley asks a very interesting question here, and maybe you just answered it actually. Are there any practical exercises you could kindly suggest as to how to address our own self-oppression while simultaneously trying to address injustice and inequity externally? Or is this simultaneous process impossible, or is it interdependent?
Whoa, that is a complicated and wonderful question. I think your question contains the answer. It is simultaneous and interdependent, and we have to work on all these three dimensions, as Rob very, very aptly noticed. The internal dimension of really understanding ourselves better, and there's lots we can do in that in an age of a wealth of self-help books and talks that we can listen to. The vertical dimension, cultivating our connection to our inner intuitive spiritual intelligence, so important every day. To frame the day by beginning and ending the day in a meditative and contemplative practice. That's really crucial. And then, of course, communities, reaching out to humanity, opening our homes, imperfect as they may feel to us, opening our homes, inviting fellow human beings, and learning together. That is the path to healing.
Yep, and you don't let people see the fact that you've got, oranges and things on the table next to you. You don't worry about that. And Rose Mustakova Posart, presumably a relative of yours.
Oh,
has this
that is my sweet daughter, who must be chiming in from London right now.
Very good. Well, she must be watching it as well. And there's no hello mom here, but I'm sure that was implied. How can the concept of inner moral coherence, oh, there's a hey mom. How can the concept of inner moral coherence be made to appeal to many youth whose interests revolve heavily around drinking and promiscuity? In the context of a world where these things are completely normalized, how can this message ever even be introduced? How do you speak to people who don't want to listen?
Wow, thank you. That's the question, isn't it?
He knows how to give her mom a hard question.
She knows how to ask good questions. I love her for it. Well, thank you for this question, Rosie. It's an excellent question. You know, in my experience working with young people, I work with people from age 15 on. In my experience, young people may not admit that in the school cafeteria, but in private one-on-one, they are very ready to admit that things fundamentally don't hold, don't make sense, and they don't feel happy. And so the path to opening the conversation, of course, is not to introduce concepts such as moral coherence, which is a little over the top to start with, but to simply share our own experience when we don't feel happy, when things don't make sense, when the attitudes that surround us, the drinking, the partying, the promiscuity starts to feel like a real dead end, and asking our peers, don't you sometimes feel the same way? Don't you sometimes feel empty inside? Because I certainly do. And that's what I hear all around me, a sense of emptiness. And so that's where the conversation begins. From there, it goes to, well, who are you, really? Mm-hmm. I mean, who is this person that is moving through her day every day? And once you ask that question, young people who are so bright and wonderful in this age very quickly realize that they're not their brand clothes. They're not the things that they do every day. They're not their peer groups. They're not the subjects they take or however they perform. There's something else, and they don't know how to speak about that. And that's the point at which we open up a conversation about the fact that, isn't it interesting that nothing in your daily experience in society and actually in education either doesn't tell you anything meaningful about who you actually are, anything that you can take hold of. Isn't that interesting? What does that mean? What is going on? And what is missing? And why would you not be depressed? Why would you not be anxious? Why would you not be drinking and self-medicating yourself?
Yeah.
If you have this sense of emptiness that you don't even know who you are. And of course, we see that, I see that from age 15 on throughout adulthood. But statistics are telling us that we increasingly, World Health Organization statistics are telling us that we see this phenomenon now in young people in the single digits.
Wow.
Along with suicide. Suicide is now rampant among young people below 10. So this was an excellent question. We have to start with honesty, the sense of emptiness, the sense of how all of this, at the end of the day, just doesn't satisfy, doesn't carry, doesn't see you through.
It gets us back to the issue of meaningful conversation and the various skills that we need to develop to have a meaningful conversation with people. And sometimes you start in one place with one person, you start with another place with another person, but you have to figure out the way to have a meaningful conversation with them. We have one more question that just popped in. Will the video of the talk and the Q&A be on the web or just the PowerPoint? We will have everything up on our YouTube channel, certainly within 24 hours, possibly even tonight. And the web page for this talk already, I don't know if it has a PowerPoint yet, but it'll have the PowerPoint up as a PDF. It will have a link to the YouTube channel, link to the talk on the YouTube channel. It already has a summary of the talk that Elena gave us. There will be a summary that's longer that's written up for our newsletter. So one of the nice things about our website is for each one of these web talks, there's a little library of materials about that web talk. And the more materials we have on each one, actually, the better. So, and here's a thank you from Sohaila. So that's good. And I think,
Thank you,
is there time for one more question, Ashley asks. And Ashley, you better hurry because we do have to wrap this up. Because we do have to close off fairly soon. I suppose Ashley is madly typing.
Let's give us a chance.
We'll give him a chance, exactly. And I should, well, I'll use this as a chance to plug our talk next Sunday. Only a week from today, Reba Caruth will be speaking about the spiritual destiny of America, looking back at the development of Christianity in Europe and America as far back as the Reformation, and sort of the spiritual resources that has given this country. And she is actually going to give us a 3-part series of talks, one in December, one in January, one in February. And here's Ashley's question: if we are inherently noble, how do we honor that as imperfect human beings? My goodness.
Well, another very good question. I would say by embracing our imperfection as very much a part of the imperfection of this physical plane of reality in which we labor. In Baha'i circles, you often hear people say, this life is a workshop, not an art gallery. It really is a workshop. It is a place where we have to both embrace our imperfection and the imperfection of everything that we have inherited from our families, and just do our best to deepen along those 3 dimensions, understanding that at the end of the day, if consciousness is causal, then our volition to deepen, to integrate ourselves, to become better human beings is powerful. That the exercise of that volition is powerful. So let's not forget, consciousness is causal, and central to consciousness is volition to integrate more deeply, not to become perfect. I don't think I've seen anything like that on this plane, but really more meaningful, because we are meaning-making creatures. And as long as we become more meaningful, more coherent in our meanings, we are fulfilling the purpose of this life, and we are evolving our consciousness. And in that way, we can also forgive all the imperfections that went before us and make peace and deconstruct in working forward.
And perhaps sometimes even be thankful that we were able to learn from those imperfections as well. I think that the whole issue of making meaning is one of the great insights I've had from religious studies and from psychology, because you can't be a sentient creature, a rational being, without asking the question, what's the meaning, what's the purpose? So in a sense, it's the trap of being a rational being, and it's also the glorious opportunity of being a rational being, that you can ask these questions. Cows can't ask these questions or think about them. Maybe elephants a little bit, since they have elephant graveyards, but basically we're the ones who are stuck with these very interesting, very difficult questions, and they are the questions ultimately that lead us to God in a way, because we have to struggle with them. So
they're also very powerful questions of meaning, because the questions of meaning are what transform us, what move us forward, what advance civilization. So it's really powerful. It's not perfect, but it's very powerful.
Yep, and that's the purpose of religion in a way, is to provide the big picture answers. And psychology tells us that it's the little details and the big picture that really makes our psyche work and gives us our tests and challenges as well as our triumphs, it seems to me. Well, Ashley says, sorry, Dr. E, thanks for being patient. And Catherine adds, I love to hear your insights and love to hear you answer more questions and discuss issues of individual challenges. Thank you. So we'll have to have you come back at some point, Elena, after your trip home to Eastern Europe, and no doubt back in Washington with your many, many tasks that you do there. We'll have to reschedule you sometime in another year or two. And I'm sure by then you'll have thought of something else to say too, since we always will. We always will. So let me put my slide back up. If Boyd, you can give it back to me. And I'll just very quickly mention a few things here. I want to mention our upcoming web talks. As I said, we have 3 talks by Reba Caruth on the spiritual destiny of America and the West. One next Sunday, the 10th, one on January 21st, and one on February 4th. But then also in January, you can see we have 2 in January, and the other one is by Joanne Borovica The 10 Plagues of Exodus in the Light of the Baha'i Writings, which is a fascinating exploration of the meaning of Old Testament texts and how, as Baha'is, we read Old Testament texts in the light of the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha. And it's not a question of a literal reading at all. It's a much more complicated story than that. And Joanne has written a book which illuminates this really quite a lot. So those are the upcoming web talks. And then, of course, just to mention the courses, writing biographies and histories has just begun, but there's still plenty of room for people to join. If you want to learn how to write something, this is a very good chance. A local history, a biography of a pioneer or an old believer that you knew. Even a 5 or 10 pager is something that you could consider. Baha'i theology starts in another week, and that's a fascinating chance to explore concepts of God, revelation, manifestation, creation, humanity, covenant, and afterlife, I believe, are the main things we list. Of course, the life and ministry of Shoghi Effendi, the promise of world peace. These are other courses coming up later in this month, as well as creating unity with friendship, fun, social vitality, and laughter, which starts at the very end of December. And that is a fun course. It really filled quite nicely last year and had a good discussion. So I want to thank everybody for participating today in this web talk. Again, Elena, thank you so much for this presentation. And I think we'll find many people, we'll find many people watching it on YouTube, I think, for years to come. And if anyone has questions, of course, they can also send them to us and we can forward them to Elena so that she can continue to answer them by email if anyone's interested in that, of course. And then we'll look forward to seeing you next week with Reba Caruth and in subsequent web talks in 2018. So thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.